So I would welcome people to come forward to the microphones and start the panel going. You've got all of the speakers in front of us. I'm going to start the first one just because Vic and I go way back, and I know that he's a wise person. You talked about that declining natural capital. Is there some public good? Is there an incentive that beyond the public good can actually inflect that curve? Or is that natural capital curve just going to be in constant decline for the next century?
Boy, thanks, Dan.
I didn't give you a heads up on that one. I thought I'd give you the soft
We had 3 hours in the car yesterday. You didn't tell me you were going to ask me the first question. I think 2 things on that. I think one thing is that what we're measuring in that natural capital curve is a mixture of non-renewables and renewables, or extraction and non-extractable. Certainly on the extraction side, we're going to continue to deplete the natural capital, but on the other side, we've got great opportunities. The part that we're not measuring in there are pieces like wetlands, like various other kinds of public goods, where I think there again we have tremendous opportunities to enhance the state of natural capital, to think about where we can better play the substitution of critical natural capital and avoid that substitution and actually invest in it. So I don't think that has to be a continuing declining line in any sense. And in fact, there's some interesting work showing evidence that at a macroeconomic level that countries that invest and maintain natural capital perform better overall on all functions of capital, and actually it's a great indicator of wealth. So I'm pretty optimistic that measurement, appropriate substitution, and investment, we can do well with those metrics.
Thanks very much. Questions or comments? You know, in my current role, I call people out of audiences and classrooms. I'm going to give a couple of people, please, Graham, if you, thank you for opening up the floor. Shout it out. I guess there is not a mic on that side.
Well, I have a question for you.
Can't see it.
And understanding that it's not great to speculate in the legal world, but if I extrapolate what you were talking about, the First Nations empowerment scheme, as statutory consents get approved, water licenses, access to feedlots, things like that, do you envision First Nations having a say and or share ownership of how I manage my farm as they enact their rights?
Just before you respond, did everybody get the question? Excellent. Please, Bill.
I don't see First Nations ever making a move on private property rights anywhere in Canada. There's enough Crown land where if they feel they have an assertion to make, it'll typically be on Crown land. Their kids are on the same school buses as your kids. I've just never. It's actually an issue in the Kamloops area in the coming election in BC, where Christy Clark has said, to the people in that area, I have your back on this stuff. They're making assertions to private ownership. I dug into that, and I believe that is overblown. I can see why she would have responded that way, because there is a global blanket land claim that would encompass, in fact, the Ajax mine is one of the is caught in the net. But the reality is that there's no way First Nations want to pick a fight on property rights. That's just not, as a minority, there's no upside in it for them. They're under tremendous stress in their communities as it is. They hardly need that going on. The only thing to take away is your private property rights are 100% protected. The system is set up from the days of Roman law. But they have land rights. And that's what's working its way into the requirement for the approval process. You'll have social license in this province when you recognize their land rights. It's not a big stretch. And there's people on this panel and people in this government who are already mentally talking like that, politically putting that out. You have to give them room to move in this province, because you're coming out of a period of massive systemic stagnation. Nothing that the government trumpeted, both governments, in terms of the resources sector, has come to fruition. And the only point I want to make is that the real power, while the eco-activists have a pretty decent winning streak on their own, it pales in comparison to the winning streak of First Nations. That's the power base. That's who is redrawing the map of Canada, one court case at a time. And they're more than prepared to work with you, and but with that sort of momentum, they're not going to settle for trinkets and bees. You've got that figured out.
Thanks very much, Mr. Bocock.
Yes, I'd like to congratulate.
Yep, you're good to go.
I'd like to congratulate Dave Stelfox on the work that he's done with the Action for Agriculture group on dramatizing the loss of farmland in the Calgary area. I'd just like to ask Dave and any of the other panelists how they see us actually accomplishing saving the best farmland around Calgary, Edmonton, and other parts of Alberta.
Question for Brad Stelfox.
Yeah, thanks, John. I suspect you may have worked with my uncle Dave maybe in previous years. Thanks for the question. Yeah, it's a big issue. It's one of these classic issues that's, it's insidious. It's only happening at small number of square meters every second, but added through time, it's massive. I kind of see this trajectory of anger, denial, depression, acceptance almost. People found it very difficult to even hear that story that was happening. I think now there's an increasing empirical recognition of the pace and magnitude of what we're losing in terms of good soils. So I think there's a role of those of us that are trying to quantify the loss, and then that shifts, I think, the priority to policies and economic instruments that can induce better behavior in terms of maintaining and recovering good soils. Maybe that would go back more to Vic as to in the Land Institute and government policy as to what we can do to turn the tide on loss of soils.
Vic, do you want to do a follow-up?
I can try to add on to that. I think that the policy one is really the challenging question. We've seen the data. I think one thing we need to recognize is that, yes, there's a loss of the productive capacity within agricultural land, but there's also loss of a host of amenities and amenity services. And it's the mixture of those two that we probably need to think about for priorities and how to identify where the scarcities are. And then I think there's a host of a set of tools. They're tricky, but transferable development rights or mechanisms like that will allow you to actually signal that we don't want to reduce this particular stock, but we also want to provide rewards for people who are protecting, that they're not penalized when they happen to be holding lands that they're no longer able to convert it to other uses. So it's really that fine line balancing act. We can look to the U.S. for experiences and lessons learned in those mechanisms that would really provide incentives for protection, but also protect people from these losses of what could be their retirement savings plans and their future funds. So that, to me, is the set of mechanisms we've really got to explore.
Thanks very much. The other mic?
Hello, my name is Elaine McIver-Blade. First off, I don't have any questions for Bill because I absolutely agree with everything he says. As a First Nations person and having lived in poverty, my question is for Ed. I know the BC carbon tax hits people at the pump, and hits people at the pump. So I'm concerned about people who are impoverished. First Nations are in there, and many other people. And so my concern is, it's just your thoughts or your perspective, does reducing greenhouse gases trump, royalty incentives, increasing the royalties to pay for, perhaps more social programs? I guess my concern is, and I've heard the term before, corporate welfare paying for some of this, and that concerns me, and I'm interested in your thoughts on that discussion.
Thank you.
Chair, and I suspect Andrew is probably going to want to jump in on this one as well. No, it shouldn't come at the expense of economic welfare, social benefit. And, obviously we need to protect those who are most at risk through an escalation of costs, whether it be on heating fuel or what you pay at the pump. And if you saw in the Alberta budget last week, there's a lot in there to protect Albertans. So that's an effective way of cushioning the blow. But the reality is that the province and industry now see making these investments as a way of tooling us to be competitive in that new world. And I talked about not being the high cost, high carbon barrel. If we don't make these investments, and I say we, I mean, CEOs are the first ones to say this, really feel that we're going to be left behind. And as Albertans, we don't want to be here as campers and leave when we're no longer competitive in energy markets. We want to be here for the long haul. So the system and the changes that they are pushing for were designed to make them competitive over the long haul. And their people, the numbers that they run, looking at the forecasts, we're all in agreement with that. And then over the short term, I just talked about some of the jobs you create, whether it's the methane reduction, whether it's energy efficiency. Investment in energy efficiency, we look on the low side, you'll create 3,000 new jobs. This is something that's going to get people who are out of work back in work. And we have that. We have the know-how, to do these things within the province. So that's our starting point is we can have our cake and eat it too. That we can get those reductions, protect people, and actually build a stronger, resilient economy.
Okay, thank you. I comment actually for the speakers, congratulate for their incitement or from the land use perspective and the policy and economics in the agricultural perspective. My comments are related to the first three speakers, Dr. Annette, Dr. Vic, and Dr. Terry Lebec. I agree with the way of seeing the land or the nature as part of our life. And as we know, we use it and we have to manage it also. We have to protect it. It's not being a farmer. I'm a farmer myself, but it's not the farmer that has to protect it or to use it. And every one of us have responsibility to protect it because it's underneath our feet. And we know that if we don't protect it, and our life would be in vain, not only now, even for the coming generations. The other question that I have is for Dr. Brock Stelfock. I agree with Mr. Bock, the question regarding the urban design. As agrologists or professional agrologists here in the House, not only the panelists, including every one of us, don't we have a say or something responsibility to influence the urban planners or other policymakers in terms of utilizing agricultural land for urban or for, it's not only that we say in workshop, but don't you have a voice to influence them so that the fertile land to stay as fertile land, because Alberta fertile land is not only breadbasket for Canada, even internationally it's very known as a breadbasket, so we have to protect it. And I raise this question to all of us, how we can influence the policymakers and urban designers.
So let's try to do that in the 2 bites. To the first 3 speakers, more on the comment I think that the questioner has made, and then we'll go to Brad after that, just on that value of land, if anybody wants to weigh in, or we can move to the question.
I can comment on that. I think one of the things we really need to do with getting value of the land more appreciated is working with youth. And a lot of people have developed really, really good programs. I'll tell you just a little story. One of my graduate students does a lot of outreach work with young people. She goes into the schools and she works with various other groups. And one of the things they did at our centennial, the Ailes Centennial, was make bee houses. And I have had so many comments from parents that have come back and said, wow, like our kids are telling us we have to put these bee houses in our backyard. We had a similar situation that occurred in another outreach program where our graduate students were talking about how you could build soil and what were the constituents of soil. And I had several parents again who responded to me that, or sent comments to me and said, oh, so now we're having to make sure that we're looking after our backyard appropriately, because the kids, they're the ones that are really getting into it, and they're really getting interested in looking at the value of it. So, and I also bring back maybe to something I said earlier about the connection to nature. I think it's really important that we all have touchstones. And so if we have those very specific, memorable experiences that help us to understand and value the land, we're more likely to move forward, not only in the consumer choices we make, but in how we raise our voices about things like agricultural land being developed in appropriate ways. So it's really getting to the heart of understanding what the land means to us and what it could mean to us and what it should mean to us.
Thank you, Anne. Terry LeBlanc.
I think one of the things that I encourage our students to sort of switch around their thinking on is, we often talk about creation care as an anthropocentric act. We are caring for creation, when in fact, I think if we were to stop and think about value of the land, et cetera, and the value that it contributes, the equation's actually the other way, that the rest of the environment contributes more to us than we do to it. And we tend to still think of it in terms of a resource to be utilized or manipulated or in some way incurred upon. And if we could begin to get our thinking around the idea that it already contributes more to us than we do to it in the overall ecosystem of the globe, we might begin to actually value the land that we're on in a better way than simply valuing it for its productivity or for its unique contribution as we manipulate it and transform it. And I think it would also address some of the other issues around land use, where we're using some of our most arable lands for dwellings and the construction of ever larger cities and urban environments and landscapes taking up huge amounts of land. The green belt in Ontario outside of Toronto is an example of an effort to forestall some of that. I'm not sure entirely successful, but we just need to swing the value equation around to understanding that the rest of the environment, whether you think of it in terms of creation or not, contributes more to us than we do to it, and we just darn well better take care of that equation.
That's a great segue into the second question around urban design and those kind of issues for Brad Stelfox.
Yeah, good question, and a follow-up to the previous good question about the value of soil. So the way I kind of see it, if you back up, we got, 4 million people, give or take, in Alberta. We're growing at about 2% per year. So clearly people are building, or new homes need to be built. And there's really four drivers on this. Fecundity, immigration. Albertans are very quickly, and have increasingly over the last 3 decades, decided that most of us need 2 homes. Fourth driver is divorce. Those things in combination are requiring an awful lot of new homes to be built. They're built by developers. The difference between growing up and growing out in the urban development spectrum is about 6% on return on your capital investment, and which is a big number if it's your risk capital. So the developers, given the current system, are much more likely to go and purchase land in the periphery and turn it into suburbia or rural residential. So they do that because it's to their economic advantage. But and I don't think they're doing anything illegal. It's just that the value of soil, whether it be its fertility or its carbon or whatever measurement we want, is externalized from the system today. Where I do see changes is not so much in soil scientists having a meaningful influence on policy, and they should, and I just think people aren't listening. It's in municipalities awakening to the realization that the true cost is not in infrastructure construction, but in infrastructure maintenance. So these many municipalities have fallen over themselves to attract developers to allow these rural lands to be built, thinking that it's a source of tax revenue. Really what it is it's a net loss on the system, because the true cost is not construction of infrastructure, it's maintenance of infrastructure. And so municipality after municipality is awakening to asking themselves, how do we pay for this? And if they had induced, or if we had policy or instruments, incentives to grow up versus out, and I know those are loaded words. So I think we're going to see municipalities begin to apply pressure to government for policy that encourages infrastructure to be built in a way that's affordable. Because maybe we could afford it at $80 a barrel, but at 25 we can't. And so there's still much conversation, but that's where I see municipalities beginning to awaken to a recognition of the need for good soils.
I appreciate your patience over there. We're just going to go to this question here, and we'll be back to you after that.
Thank you very much. My name is Babashola Jiboye, and my question is to Ed and any other panelists that can weigh in as well. As you're probably aware, the big energy producer, oil and gas producer in the province are under pressure from the regulators and especially their shareholders to provide more specifics on the government engagement and how they plan to remain competitive in a low carbon economy. So as somebody who's worked with these producers, I was wondering if you could share some specifics on, or some of your insights on how you think they can compete in a low carbon economy, because on the surface, the logic is not very clear.
Thank you. Ed?
Sure. You have to recognize, if we're talking about the oil and gas industry, they're under a lot of pressure these days from multiple angles. Shareholder pressure. Just think of social license issues, not just in Canada. Just think of supplier costs. Think of trust, working with local communities, oil and gas companies having their assets nationalized if there's a change in government. So it's a tough industry to be in. But we recognize we need more energy. Like, that much is clear. Canada needs more energy. Canada, if we're to get to any kind of meaningful GHG reduction target, we have to look at what we have and electrify a lot of transportation, electrify a lot of heat. That means more energy. Not necessarily oil and gas, that means electricity. But on the oil and gas side, any scenario that I've looked at recently, a credible one, and how the oil and gas industry can thrive in a 2C world, says what we're going to look at likely is you're going to see some sort of net decline in oil consumption and oil demand, but you're going to see an offsetting increase in natural gas. And the reason we need to do that is because exactly that. We need to electrify mobility and electrify heat across the world if we're going to stay in a 2C world. So if you're an oil and gas producer, you might say, all right, declining demand for oil, well, that's going to push prices down. So I'd better lean heavily on my value chain and use value engineering to drive my price down. And the good thing is a lot of carbon reduction initiatives, they create more efficiency, and you can reduce emissions, and you can drive your costs down over the long term as well. And I said that was what sort of, was the underpinning for the CEOs in talking to us. But to be clear, there's a big opportunity on the gas side. So look at Shell. Shell has gone from a company that's heavily weighted on oil to now a company that's betting its future strategy on integrated gas going forward. And on the oil side, on the transport side, they say, well, what are we going to do? We're going to get good at producing biofuels, and we haven't given up on hydrogen. We're going to see if we can produce hydrogen. Toyota's betting big on it. Japan is betting big on it. Germany is betting big on it. So they want to be provider of low-carbon molecules. Last thing, sorry, I'm going on here. We recognize that for companies, if they're going to transition in light of these pressures into a new oil and gas market, where you see oil possibly declining, gas increasing, more energy required, they need to generate cash in the short term. So any way we look at it, we need fossil fuels. If you generate that cash in the short term, you build a strong balance sheet, then as a company that gives you options. And we all just have to recognize that that's a short-term reality.
Thank you. I'm Sonia Raven. I'd like to thank the panel for their very thought-provoking presentations this morning. It was very, very good. My question actually pertains to probably Bill Gallagher, and I'd like to get Terry's thoughts on this as well. The BC government has approved Site C when the First Nations have already stated that it is their ancestral land with significant cultural value, and this is First Nations that do not have treaty. How is that going to proceed? In the mid to late 70s, the first protests stopped Site C then. I've always thought that it would be the First Nations that would have to weigh in on this one for it to stop again. With it progressing, with the work that is already being done, how does this work when they're supposed to be consulted and they don't have a treaty, and yet this is allowed to continue by a provincial government?
Question on Site C Dam in northern British Columbia, Bill?
Yes, the Site C Dam has the potential to become a flashpoint in the British Columbia election. It involves the damming of a river that's already seriously compromised. Depending on your point of view, you could take a practical view that since the river is already seriously compromised, and since hydroelectricity is not carbon intensive, that this would be a logical place to augment or increase your power output. Or you could take the view that if it's an already compromised river, it should not be more compromised. It's approved, it's got a license, and it's going to become an election issue. Now, the First Nations who might decide this might be actually Treaty First Nations up in Treaty 8, who are in the middle of the fracking and who are fighting for the integrity of maintaining their groundwater as being non-compromised. So the mantra is, Premier, you can have Site C or Treaty 8 fracking, but you can't have both. And that's what's headed into the next election. And that brings the Petronas play in, because that is a fully funded, fully financed Asian play to promote fracking at one end of the pipeline, get the pipeline built, and an LNG facility on Leilu Island. So yes, it's complicated. The Treaty 8 fracking does not take place on Aboriginal tidal lands. The treaty is settled there, but they have land rights, water rights. Site C is on Aboriginal tidal land, but there's no formal declaration of Aboriginal title made there. So it's a gray area, and it basically is going to play out full tilt as the election kicks into high gear.
Terry Little, oops, excuse me, sorry for the interruption. Terry?
No, I was going to make the last point that Bill did, and I see no need to elaborate on it. I think that's been well said.
Very good. Questions or comments from the panel?
Dan, can I just add one more point on Site
do.
C? You know, I've paddled the Alberta side of the Peace River. I've paddled it twice, from Dunvegan all the way down to Peace River itself. It's compromised, but it's a beautiful river. And it's a thriving, still healthy river. So I look at Site C, and part of me, the conservationist in me, thinks it's a conservation and archaeological disaster waiting to happen. The hard thing is, and made this point earlier, is we need more electricity in Canada. And where is it going to come from? And it's going to force some hard choices. Arguably, I've seen models that suggest in BC you need 20 gigawatts of new power, which means 4 to 5 Site Cs. It means more. So we're going to have to make some hard decisions on our electricity grid around things like nuclear and whether we're actually able to phase out nuclear in places like Ontario, and what's the future of big hydro. I don't have the answer, except the one thing we all agree on is go really hard on the demand reduction initiatives through energy efficiency.
Thanks very much. Question over here?
Yeah, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but I have a question for doctors Ann, Vic, and Brad in regards to land use. I'm a municipal planner in a small rural municipality, and I appreciate the questions that have come up about land use planning in Alberta and the protection and preservation of agricultural land. But further to that is the concept of preservation, protection of ecosystem goods and services as a whole. And where I really struggle is that in Alberta, there is currently no mandatory regulatory provisions for the protection of these ecosystem goods and services. When you look at the Municipal Government Act, when you look at the land use policies that are currently in place, the land use framework and the regional plans, none of them have teeth. They're all policy, and implementing them at a local level is practically impossible, especially when you don't have political will from your council. As an administrator, I can preach best practices till the cows come home, but it really means nothing at the end of the day if your councillors aren't willing to stand up and put those forward as a priority politically at a local level. So I'm wondering where we go forwards with this topic, especially for rural municipal planners and urban planners as well, when there's no political will and then we don't have the ability to back it up through a regulatory framework.
Thanks very much. To the panelists.
Well, Goodness, there we go. Let me start on this on a couple of pieces. First, shameless advertising. I think you're raising a question about the governance issues around land use framework and the regulatory structure of municipalities. That is a key concern that we keep hearing time and time again. Should it empower municipalities to actually have a backup of a tight bound or a regulation that they can then impose, or should there be more autonomy among municipalities? I think we continue to fight with that. The shameless advertising is May 4th and 5th, Alberta Land Institute Conference, Land Use 2016. 1/3 of the conference is focused on this issue. I think it's a really important one. We see other models where people have tried to address this debate about how it works. But let me pick up a couple other points without dominating the discussion too much. I agree that we haven't done very well on the ecosystem services side of really putting things in place with teeth. I'm still pretty optimistic. We have an enabling structure that actually I think is better than a lot of jurisdictions in North America. When I travel around the North American landscape, people compliment me on what we were trying to do with setting objectives in the land use framework, enabling various market-based instruments to try to send those price signals. And I think there's a little bit of hope. The one that I'll pull out is the wetlands around the Calgary area, where there's a pretty direct signal. If you're a developer, you're draining a wetland, you're paying a price. We don't know if we got that price yet right, but it's a decentralized signal that says you're going to have to pay. That money goes into a fund to restore those wetlands, to bring back those services. So getting the prices right is important. Sending the signal, we can do it on wetlands. Can we do it for other ecosystem services? Maybe, but at least that's a pretty progressive experiment in making that actually happen. Send the signal for the scarcity of those ecosystem services, do something with the funds to reinvest into the capital stock to bring them back up to speed. Maybe we can learn enough from that model to use it in other cases, whether it's prime agricultural land with amenity values or other types of services. So I'm still on the glass half full side of that discussion.
Ann or Brad?
I agree with Vic, and I'm on that glass half full area as well. I think the signals are really important, and getting those signals out in a variety of ways to the appropriate stakeholders is critical.
Yeah, I think you actually described it yourself very well. Yeah, I see the embryonic market-based instrument conversation happening, and I'm encouraged by that. As an empirical scientist that's just trying to measure this stuff year by year, the trends are continuing to be down as the amount of net wetlands we lose, gross wetlands we lose, dwarf those that are reconstructed. So whether it be air quality or water quantity, riparian habitat and agricultural lands, loss of good soils, those trends continue to go down. And so all it tells us is we need more of these conversations and to engage a public in realizing that they're giving up something very special. Trends are discouraging, conversation is encouraging. How much of it is rhetoric? And I think you used the word teeth 2 or 3 times, and I think we need some bold leadership in this arena.